All right, so we're going to be back in the computer lab on Tuesday because we're going to be doing another Excel analysis that you'll need to know for the homework I've just given you. That homework assignment's not due until Sunday after spring break. So my suggestion, as always, is get an early start on the assignment because you're going to remember more about benefit cost analysis after today's lecture than you will on Saturday night, Saturday, April 9th. We tend to forget things over time, especially after a long and enjoyable spring break vacation, all right? So, also looking into the future, when you come back from the spring break, it's going to be reality right from the first day because we have a midterm exam on Sunday the 10th, and the location for that exam will be in the computer lab. So that's probably a pretty good hint that we'll have at least something on the exam that's going to require you to use Excel. I'll talk more about the exam and what you'll need to do prepare for it later in this week, but I just wanted to give you the location up front. One last thing to keep in mind is that Sunday, April 17th is when the project is due, and so today is the 27th of March, so you've still got several weeks. I'm starting to get more questions about the project, indicating people are starting to think about it. So, any questions related to these announcements before we start talking about the new material? All right. Today we're going to begin discussing benefit cost analysis. And here's a picture of something we all like. Everyone loves money, right? It gives us so many fun things when we have money. We can go skydiving with money. You can have a nice meal, buy yourself a comfortable car, airline tickets to fun places. So it's like they're fun coupons. You can get married when you have a certain amount of money. That's right. So money allows us to do lots of things, but you don't need money for everything, right? And in fact, there's a famous saying that there's more to life than money. And so you don't need money to enjoy spending time with your family on a Friday afternoon. And you don't have to pay money to enjoy the beautiful weather outside. No one's charging for nice weather, unless you're traveling somewhere with nice weather, right? But here, in the last couple of weeks, we've had beautiful weather, and you don't have to pay more for the day when it's a beautiful weather versus rainy weather. So there's lots of things in life that don't deal with profit, and so when it comes to those things that the government has its involvement with, we need a different way of analyzing alternatives than the profit-centered approach that we've used until now. So public sector projects are often conducted at a loss. The government does things even though it's not going to generate money for them. So think about, for instance, a hospital. The government builds a hospital and provides medical care to its citizens because you have to have good health as a foundation for many other things in life. You can't, for example, get a job and pay taxes and participate in society if you're very ill. And so all of these things, this is a lengthy list of projects that don't necessarily give the government a profit. They may take some revenue for these things. So, for example, sewerage. In a lot of places you have to pay a separate fee in addition to not only paying for electricity and water, but in a lot of places you have to pay another fee to the government for the cost of processing sewage. Now, we know it would be very unpleasant if no one was collecting the sewage. You know, if you're in a compact residential area, in an urban environment, if the waste isn't taken somewhere, the garbage, the sewage, if the waste isn't taken away, then people's health and enjoyment can suffer. And so the government is not getting rich off of processing sewage. Usually what they're doing is just collecting enough revenue only to cover the costs. And in fact, even though they're collecting revenue, a lot of times they're still subsidizing the cost of that thing. They're not entirely breaking even. So if you look at some of the other things on this list, airports, for instance, if you look sometimes at when you're booking tickets for a trip, there's the amount that the airline themselves gets, and then there can be often a long list of fees, security fees, airport concession fees, and so on. And so when you pay for a ticket, a portion of that goes to the airport, but it's not the case that the airport is owned by a single person who's becoming very wealthy by maximizing the fees they charge for the passengers. The airports are most of the time. Now, there's exceptions with everything, but most of the time airports are owned by municipal governments, and they're operated just sort of on a break-even basis. So the question becomes, how do we know if we should do a project if it's not designed to turn a profit? You know, if you're going to be losing money on the project, does that mean that every project is okay because there's no criteria that one project that loses money is as good as another project that loses money? So obviously there has to be some way of accounting for the benefits and the costs. And so that's what we're going to try to introduce today, is how do we compare things that seem so dissimilar? Because every budget has lots of competing demands. You know, here in the Emirate of Sharjah, for example, the annual budget may include some money for keeping University City beautiful. You know, they have to spend money on the flowers and the maintenance and trash collection. And so every dirham that they spend on keeping University City beautiful is a dirham that they can't spend on fire protection, for instance. If you spend money in one place, that means you can't spend that same money somewhere else. It's a mutually exclusive expenditure. So what we're going to do is try and figure out a method for comparing and weighing the benefits and disadvantages and costs of projects so that we pick the projects that yield the best benefit to the citizens, even if the benefit is non-monetary, as many things are in public sector projects. So let's compare the differences to what we've been doing so far and where our analysis is headed for the next several lectures. So thus far, we've been focusing mostly on companies and how they would view a project. So a private company is going to be investing maybe a small, medium, or even a large amount of money, depending on how big the company itself is. There are some companies in the world that are now have more money than countries. You know, some of the largest companies out in the world, like Apple, for instance, ExxonMobil, there are many companies that have budgets that are greater than relatively medium and small-sized countries. But on average, if we're going to compare how long the projects are that a company invests in to the kind of projects that a government agency invests in, when a government agency builds a hospital, for instance, they want that to last for a long time, you know, 30 to 50 years or maybe even beyond. The same thing is true for a roadway project or building a bridge or putting in a park. The things that a city is going to build are meant to last for the long term. Whereas a private company, when they invest in something, maybe they're investing in new technology to make a computer chip more efficient. Well, they have to get their returns on that investment over a very short time frame because that computer chip will be obsolete very quickly because computer equipment is always getting better year after year. And so private companies have to get their return on investment over a short time frame compared to public entities. We've already talked about how oftentimes a public project is operated where the annual cash flow doesn't have any leftover profits. The annual cash flow is maybe enough to break even, and sometimes it's operated at a loss. So take, for example, the parks in Sharjah. You have to pay admission to some of the parks in Sharjah, but the admission cost does not cover the cost of the land when that park was first built. It doesn't cover the cost of the maintenance and the operation. So there is revenue, but it may not even be breaking even. Whereas in the case of a private company, since it's profit-driven, their annual cash flow has to be positive, or else after a few years they'll go out of business. So that's a difference between public and private. Another difference is where the money itself comes from. In the case of a private company, they raise capital to make an investment by selling stock, by taking loans from banks, or maybe issuing bonds, whereas a private government is collecting taxes from its citizens, charging fees for registration. Sometimes when a big public entity needs to borrow money, they can issue bonds as well. So there's both corporate bonds and municipal bonds, and in fact even national governments can issue bonds. Companies, when they do issue a bond, they have to pay a higher interest rate compared to governments. Why do you suppose this difference might be the case? Why do you suppose that a government pays a lower interest rate when they borrow money? Why would people buy a bond from the government of Germany at a lower interest rate than they could buy a bond from HSBC Bank? Why do you think? Safer. Yeah. The government of Germany has shown that it's always going to pay its debts, and it has pretty good collateral. The country of Germany is the collateral for the bonds that are issued by the German government. Not necessarily the land itself, but the German government has the legal right to collect taxes from its citizens. And so they've got this big economy that they're allowed to tax. And so people who buy bonds from a government are thinking in their mind, that government has a pretty good resource that they can draw on to make the payments back to me. Whereas a private company, they may have projects, they may have assets, but there's a chance that they're going to go bankrupt, and the chance that a government is going to go bankrupt is usually smaller than a company. Now, there are some governments out there that actually are paying very high interest rates, and most notoriously, the government of Greece has a really hard time borrowing money because their finances aren't looking very good at the moment. People don't pay taxes as much as they're supposed to in Greece, and they've got a lot of debt relative to their revenue. But generally speaking, the general trend is that public agencies have to pay less to borrow money than a private company. Was there a question? Greece, yeah. Greece is a little unstable, so they have to pay about 10 to 12% interest to borrow money, compared to Germany is paying less than 1% to borrow money. So, selection criteria is telling you how do you know which one to pick. Well, when we were talking about private companies, the way that you know which alternative to pick is the one that gives you the highest rate of return, when we're talking about external rate of return, or we could do a present worth analysis and the one that gives you the highest present worth. So it's all about the money. That's how you know which alternative to select for a private company. In the case of a public entity, when you're trying to balance between should we spend money to build a park, to buy a new fire truck, or to buy an x-ray machine for the hospital. You know, we only have a certain amount of money. How do we know which one to do? Some people are going to, you know, the people who aren't sick and who aren't worried about fire protection, maybe they're arguing for the park. And so there's a lot of different alternatives and motivations that have to be compared. So there's multiple criteria for deciding which alternative to select. And that also ties into the environment of evaluation. So what that means is it's all about the money in the case of a private company, but for a public entity, politically inclined means that it's not just about the money. Sometimes people are worried about noise, and so if there's a public hearing where everyone's arguing about a project and its selection, politics is sort of the art of making compromises and balancing competing objectives. And so lots of different viewpoints, lots of preferences, and how to decide which one to choose isn't as simple as it is for private companies. One note at the bottom of the slide here, just the idea that money is not an infinite resource. That in order for the government to do a project, they have to take the money from something else. That means they either have to take the money from another project that they could have done, or in the case of taxes, for the government to fund its expenditures, they're taking money from people. So when I'm in the United States, I pay more taxes than when I'm here. When I'm here, I don't think I pay any taxes. It's very nice. We're very lucky to live here in the UAE. Because in the US and in Europe and lots of places in the world, you have to pay your government taxes, and hopefully they spend it wisely. Sometimes they don't. There are some notorious examples where they're wasting money. But for you to build a park or a hospital or buy a fire truck, that money has to come from somewhere. So we have to be very careful about only selecting alternatives that are honestly justified. The approach I'm going to teach you can be cheated. I mean, you can do little tricks and try and make a project look good, but as engineers, we have to act ethically, and we're going to talk about ethics in a couple of lectures and how it's important to select the right alternative on an ethical basis. All right. So how do you compare things that are so dissimilar, like a fire truck and a public park? Well, one of the things we have to do in order to compare them is to try and monetize each project effect and classify the effects as benefit, disbenefits, or cost. So these three categories: benefit, disbenefit, or cost. So here's what we're talking about. A benefit is something that's going to bring an advantage to the public. If you improve the condition of the roads, for instance, the benefit to the public is you're saving time. And so my time is worth money, your time is worth money. If I'm not sitting in traffic, I can spend it doing something else. And so that's an example of a benefit of a public project. When you improve the roads, delay is reduced. A disbenefit is something that's actually going to harm the public from the project. So let me ask you this. If an airport is being built someplace, can you think of a disbenefit of a new airport being constructed? Yes. Noise, absolutely. The sound coming from an airport can be very, very loud. And things aren't so, we live close to an airport here. Here on campus, you sometimes will hear the planes going into the airport, but it's nothing like it used to be. There used to be some very noisy cargo jets coming in and out of the Sharjah airport. And maybe I noticed it more when I first got to AUS back in 2005 because my apartment was facing directly the airport. So in the middle of the night, I would hear loud, loud whine of the jet engine. It would wake me up. So that's a huge disbenefit, having people's sleep interrupted. So here's some examples of other kinds of disadvantages that can arise from a project, like delay. During the construction phase of a project, that's going to cause a lot of delay, temporarily, hopefully. Environmental damage. When we build things, we usually disrupt the natural state of the environment, and that can have consequences down the line. Decreased value of assets or revenue. So what if you live in a lovely neighborhood, everything is fine, and then they want to build a jail just on the other side of the fence? How would everyone feel about having jail on the other side of the fence? What that would do is it would decrease the value of your assets. Your house that was previously worth 1 million dirhams, maybe now as soon as they finish the jail, it's only worth 500,000 dirhams because no one wants to live next to a jail, right? The prisoners are always breaking out and you hear the riots. Not very relaxing, right? So there's something, an abbreviation that's often used talking about that idea, NIMBY. And you'll maybe hear about this abbreviation in environmental engineering as well. It stands for not in my backyard. Like, everyone loves the idea, yes, we should have a garbage dump, but it should not be in my backyard. It should be somewhere else. Yes, we should have a sewage treatment plant, but I don't want it in my backyard. A prison. There's so many different things. An airport. We like those things. A metro station. But you don't want to be living very close to the metro station because it can be too noisy. So those are all examples of disbenefits. And the tricky thing is we have to find out, for an airport, what is the monetary disbenefit of noise? And this is where engineers start to cooperate with sociologists and psychologists. And we basically say, here's what I'm planning to build. You tell me how much is the noise actually worth, or how much is it going to cost? What's the monetary disbenefit of these things that we usually don't deal with as engineers? Reduction in the quality of life. We'd probably do a pretty bad job putting a dollar value on that. So in this course, usually what I'll do is I'll just tell you what is the benefit or disbenefit or cost, and then we're going to do our analysis based on assumptions. But in the real world, you have to find someone who's done this sort of analysis before, someone with experience who can do an accurate model, and they'll provide the numbers for you. The cost is sort of the easiest part because benefits and disbenefits aren't necessarily tied to money as closely as the costs. The costs, that's what we've been doing already. You know, looking at the initial expenditure, the annual operation and maintenance, maybe considering a salvage value at the end. We're already pretty comfortable handling the costs. So any questions so far about these three definitions? When we do our analysis, we're going to try and find out the value of the benefits. Remember, we're going to put a dollar or a dirham value on the benefits, but we need to take it either to the present or to the future or on an annual worth basis. All three of these terms, we have to take it to the same time frame, because we already know that you can't have the expenses in the future and the revenue now. You have to put everything in a consistent time frame to be able to get a good analysis. And that'll continue to be true even when we're talking about these public projects. Do not use a minus sign ahead of costs, and that's because the formula that we're going to use already has the minus sign built into it. And one other note is that when the government is saving money, you subtract that from costs. We'll see that in a couple of examples that we work. So before we start doing calculations related to benefits and costs, I wanted to show you some pictures of two different buildings back at Marshall University. This is my home university. I'm just at AUS temporarily. I'm just here for 1 year. Next fall I'll be back at Marshall. And this is our engineering building. It's just 1 year old, and it was built from partly state money and partly from a private donor. And what they did is the university sent out a request for bids, and so several different construction companies looked at the plans that the architects had made, and then they all said, these different construction companies, how much they will charge to make the building. And then the university picks the construction company that is qualified and has the lowest bid. And then they build it. So the other model, there's a different building on campus. This is the Student Recreation Center. And so this is like where the pool and the workout room, and there's an indoor track. This is the gym, basically, sports center. This was built in a completely different way. The university didn't have the money they needed to build the sports center, but they really wanted a sports center. So what they said is, they put out a proposal for companies, and they told the company, if you build the building on our campus, we will provide the land, the company builds the building, and then the company will own the building for 20 years, and the university promises to force the students to pay a fee to use the sports center. And so every semester, I think the students at Marshall are paying, maybe $300 to use the sports center. And so it's an advantage for the university because they have a new building that they paid nothing for. And it's an advantage to the private company because they have guaranteed revenue from the students who are using the building. And then at the end of 20 years, the university will own the building. The private company turns it over to the university, and then the university itself will begin to own and operate that facility. So those are two different models for how a project gets completed. And in the first, there's a little more risk. Well, maybe there's risk in both. It's just the question is who's sharing the risk. In the first instance, the university is holding most of the risk. But in the second case, the university and the private company are sharing the risk together. So let's talk about this. That engineering building was built on a fixed price basis. And what that means is that the construction company and the university agreed that they would pay $55 million for the building, so that the construction company, if they spend less than $55 million, then they get to keep it. You know, hopefully their revenue or their estimate included some amount of profit for them. There's another kind of cost reimbursable project, and that is where instead of agreeing to a certain price, a contractor agrees that they will do an activity and get their costs reimbursed plus a certain amount for profit. And so when an engineer is working as a private consultant, oftentimes they'll have cost reimbursable. So it's like an hourly rate that's based on the amount of work that's going to be done. So these are two different types of projects. But another type of project, public-private partnership, that's where the contractor and the person who's undertaking the project, in the case of those buildings, the university, share the project risk. And so there's a couple of different types. Design build is where the person who is designing the facility is the one who's also building it. But what I showed you there, the sports center at Marshall, was design, build, operate, maintain, finance. So actually the contractor is doing everything. They design it, they build it, operate it, maintain it, finance it, they own it, they have guaranteed revenue. It's what's called a turnkey project, where the university just has to say, build it, and then their headaches are finished. The project coordinator has to do everything else. And so these are kind of interesting. The book goes into some details explaining the differences between these types of contracts, but I wanted to make you aware of them on sort of a basic ground level understanding. Any questions about these different categories of projects? Okay, so here's the formula we're going to be using today. I have an in-class exercise for you, and what we're going to do is calculate both the conventional and modified benefit to cost ratio. Here's how we know if we should do a project. If there's more benefits than costs. It's really simple, actually. I mean, if a project is going to cost $5, but you only get $4 in benefits, obviously you shouldn't spend $5 to get $4 in benefits. It doesn't make sense. But if you can spend $1 to build a project, that's the cost, and then it gives benefits like reduced congestion, improved health, better environment. If it yields more benefits than costs, then you should do the project. And that's what these ratios tell us. When a ratio is above 1, that tells you there's more benefits than costs. If the ratio is below 1, that tells you you shouldn't do the project because the costs outweigh the benefits. Now, conventional and modified differ mainly in how you account for maintenance and operations. And in the case of the conventional B to C ratio, it says put the maintenance and operation costs in the denominator, just lump all of the costs together. Modified, some people argue, no, you shouldn't do that. Some people say you should subtract the maintenance and operation costs from whatever benefits there are. So I don't know which one is right. Most of the time we'll do conventional B to C analysis, but which one you calculate is just a matter of substituting into the formula. There's one other way of looking at projects, and that's from the contractor's point of view. This conventional and modified B to C ratio looks at the project as a whole from the viewpoint of society. So it's including the benefits, costs, and what does D stand for? Disbenefits. And so what sorts of things are disbenefits? Do you remember what category that represents? Noise, traffic, environmental degradation, like the annoyance of looking at something ugly. You know, like if they decide to put a billboard up right outside your window, then you have to look at that. So those are disbenefits. This, the profitability index, the contractor who is building the project doesn't have to suffer the disbenefits. The contractor who's building the project is concerned mostly on benefits and costs. And so sometimes we'll calculate the profitability index, and the main idea there is just you ignore the disbenefits because it's the public that has to deal with those, not you, the contractor. All right. So here's today's in-class exercise. Let me hand out the paper while we talk about this. We have a case where we are considering a new highway, and we want to study what's going to happen over the course of 20 years. And so over those 20 years, we know what the cost of construction is going to be. We know the maintenance and operation expenses. We're given some disbenefits. And what you're going to need to do is follow the steps. You know, I've got step A, step B, step C. I've given it to you in order so that if you calculate in order, then you're able to just go through and have everything you need. Let me put the formulas on the screen. The formula is not on the paper, so copy the formula onto your paper. Conventional, modified, and profitability index. And then go through A through G. On the back side of the paper is the table for 4%. We're using 4% as the discount rate for this project. After so much time using Excel, you had some cobwebs in your mind on how to use these old-fashioned table lookup factors again. So it's always good to do this again, because these are the types of problems you'll see on the FE. Everyone here is eventually going to have to take the FE exam, right? So they love to give questions like this on the FE. The table lookup factors are actually in the supplied reference manual that is given. So we've got to take everything to the present for each of these. The initial costs to the present, 72 million. Cost and maintenance to the present, 13.6 million, and so on. So when we do that, the conventional tells us the project is not acceptable. It's below 1. So why? What's wrong with this project? They want to build a new highway. Isn't it always good to build a new highway? What it looks like is just it's a very expensive highway. $72 million to build it, $13.6 million over 20 years to maintain it, but it's only delivering $51 million worth of benefits, and in addition to that, there's a lot of disbenefits as well. People who own shops along the construction corridor are going to have a lot of negative consequences because of the project. So when you add up the good and the bad and try and do a balance, since the factor is below 1, that tells us we shouldn't do the project. Just to be sure though, let's check the modified B to C analysis to see if things look as bad there. And unfortunately they do. Even when we do it as modified, it looks worse. Because in the case of the modified, that's subtracting our benefits even more. So you can see that the ratio is going to be 0.305 in the case of the modified B to C analysis. And then even from the standpoint of the contractor, ignoring the disbenefits, the profitability index is below 1. So it seems like this proposed project should just be thrown into the garbage. We shouldn't do it. It's too expensive, not delivering enough benefits. So that's today's in-class exercise. Now the history of this whole thing is kind of interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get together on Tuesday. Till then, hope you have a good day, and let me know if you've got any questions as you get an early start on the homework. Take care. Remember, we're in the computer lab on Tuesday.